It was the night before my wedding. The house smelled like lemon polish and cheap perfume, the living room lamps throwing a soft warmth over framed photos that had long ago stopped being honest. I was sitting on the floor, the silk gown folded beside me, when someone put a cup of chamomile by my hand and said it was to calm my nerves. I drank it without thinking. I woke up cold, my scalp raw in a way that made me dizzy before I even understood why. The mirror in the hallway showed clumps of hair on the rug like confessions. My name is Elena Marquez, and at 31, I believed I had built a life that distanced me from the family dramas that used to define me. The truth is more complicated. The people who promised to protect our name decided that the best way to keep our reputation intact was to take something from me and call it sacrifice. What they did was intimate, public, and calculated. What I did next was quieter at first, and then unstoppable. Stay with me, because in the next minutes you will hear about the notes, the hidden recordings, the receipts, the technician who refused to be bought, and a ceremony that was supposed to seal my future but instead opened a verdict. When the doors opened the next day, 200 faces would watch more than a bride walk down an aisle. They would witness a choice being ripped apart and put back together under very bright lights. Let me start at the beginning. I will tell you something about the house I grew up in because the walls remember things we prefer not to say aloud. My mother Margaret always ironed the napkins at dinner and called it respectability. She would run her thumb along the edge of a tablecloth and tell me which cousins were allowed to visit and which ones were only for appearances. When I was small, she braided my hair into long ropes and said that long hair meant we were women who kept secrets for the family. My father Daniel had a laugh that filled rooms and bank accounts that fixed problems before anyone could call them what they were. My older sister Claire was the golden child. She got the scholarships, the praise, the invitations to the mayoral events. I was the one who learned to look down when people praised Claire so my eyes did not show the small stealing ache I carried. Childhood smells are vivid to me now. There was the metallic tang of coins on my father's desk when he counted envelopes, the scent of talc for my mother's wardrobe, the cinnamon candles they lit the week before big parties so the house would smell like hospitality and not like the arguments it had hosted. Those memories are not neatly painful. They are soft at the edges and sharp in the center. They taught me to hold my breath and keep my opinions small. School years forced a different set of skills. I learned to translate silence into survival. When a teacher praised me for getting a scholarship and my mother clapped louder for Claire, I learned how to look grateful while feeling invisible. The city I moved to for college smelled of diesel and possibility. I studied architecture because I liked the way structures could be honest in ways people sometimes were not. I learned to love the precision of lines, the way a plan could predict how light would fall. There was freedom there, and for a while, it felt like I had stepped into a life of my own choosing. But freedom has its costs. When I refused to take the job my father arranged for me with one of his partners, saying I wanted to work for myself, there was a week of polite silence, and then a family meeting where my choice was described as impractical. I remember the heat in my palms and the way my father's fingers closed over a set of car keys as if he owned not just metal, but the future I had tried to build for myself. That was the first time I understood that reputation was a currency and that sometimes our family banked on secrecy. There was a moment of loss in my mid-20s that reset everything. My grandmother Rosa died on a rainy Tuesday, and the funeral doubled as a lesson in management. Names were corrected, alliances reaffirmed, and a will was read in a voice that tried to be both neutral and decisive. I received a watch meant to be a gesture of inclusion and a hug that felt like a transaction. After the funeral, I left with a packet of old letters and an intuition that some of the neat sentences in those letters had been written to justify things we never spoke about. The present I had pieced together began to feel porous. My wedding planning was supposed to be my answer to that porosity, the place where I would put my own stamp over the old patterns. It was not a rebellion, it was a wish. I did not expect it to become an arena. The night before the wedding reads like 1,000 tiny betrayals stitched together. I remember the texture of the dress when I folded it onto the sofa, the cool silk whispering against my skin, the faint rust of sequins. Jamal, my childhood friend who had become my confidant in the city, knocked and said he wanted to check the AV plan for the reception because he could not be there the next day. He left his jacket on the banister and hummed a song that used to make us laugh. My mother checked in 3 times with a makeup artist who smelled of rose oil and glycerin. Claire called to confirm seating arrangements. Aunt Rosa lent me an heirloom comb that had belonged to our great aunt. The house smelled like the lemon polish again and some floral perfume Margaret favored. Later that night, Margaret brought me tea. She insisted I rest and let her do the finishing touches on my hair so I would look proper at the ceremony. She held my chin in her hand, the way she did when I was little, and told me there was no need for drama. I remember the mushy citrus of the tea and the way sleep pulled at my eyelids like a tide. There was a sound in the living room later, a shuffle that I thought was Jamal rearranging speakers. In the morning, the tide had receded and left something exposed. I woke in the early gray with a sour taste in my mouth, a taste that had nothing to do with the tea. The hallway light was too bright and made everything clinical. I touched my scalp and felt edges where smooth hair should be. Panic was immediate, the way your body knows an emergency before your mind catches up. My hands were shaking, and the sound of my breath seemed too loud in the small space. The rug was littered with hair, dark against the white. The silk of my dress felt like an accusation when I wrapped it around me. I called for my mother, and she appeared calm in a bathrobe that smelled faintly of lavender, as if she had thought ahead to comfort. Her smile did not reach her eyes. I asked what happened, and she said softly, "I had to do it." She said it like a verdict. I remember saying, "Why would you do that?" And she said, "Our name, Elena. You are making us vulnerable." Claire stood in the doorway, face pale like porcelain, and said words that did not hold warmth. There was a flurry of voices then, neighbors peeking through curtains, the kind of small-town gossip that has big teeth. I felt something in me split between disbelief and the cold click of recognition. The hands that braided me as a child had cut me down in the dark. That morning became a crucible. I could have screamed and canceled everything. I could have made the outrage private and swallowed it whole. Instead, I chose to take a photograph, to document the scene as if I were a detective at my own life. I ran my fingers along the carpet and felt the gritty traces of something on the fibers, a powdered sheen that might explain the sleep. I touched the rim of the cup Margaret had left and tasted nothing but chamomile and a faint chemical undernote I could not name. Claire said, "It is for the best." My father refused to meet my eyes. My phone lit with messages from cousins asking if I was okay and offering condolences that felt like instructions. The house, which had always been a shield of manners and curated images, now felt like the stage of an allegation. I held the dress to my chest and thought about what it would mean to let the ceremony go ahead. I thought about the faces that would gather in low light to judge, to celebrate, to witness. I thought about how this could become a performance of humiliation or a performance of accountability. That hinge is where the rest of the story starts. I will be honest about what motivated me because it was not instantaneous. Part of me wanted revenge. Another part wanted the defense of silence that families like mine trade between them like currency. What changed was when I remembered a voicemail left on my phone 3 months earlier. It was a recording of a conversation between my father and a man named Hector who worked for one of his contractors. The voice was muffled, but the meaning was clear. They discussed a payment to the venue manager to prioritize donations over questions, to keep certain invoices off the books. It was a ledger of protection. When I listened to the file in the safety of my apartment, the room smelled like cold coffee and printer ink, and I felt the cumulative weight of small conspiracies. That voicemail became a hypothesis. I began to wonder how many times the family had sacrificed candor for the veneer of respect. I started to look for patterns. There were canceled receipts, payments recorded under odd names, a clinic visit logged for one cousin that matched a weekend where gossip needed to be suppressed. I opened a folder in my cloud account and pulled together emails, a few shaky videos Jamal had taken at family events, and a set of financial records that did not match narratives told at dinner tables. The motive that had overlapped in those documents was always reputation. The story they cared about protecting was the public image of being flawless pillars of the community. The cost was concealed transactions, quiet manipulations, and in my case, a violation disguised as a salvage operation. I named the people who mattered in this net because alliances would be essential. There was Margaret, my mother, who cut my hair and who organized the household with precision. There was Daniel, my father, who managed the family finances and who smiled with a confidence that never touched his eyes. There was Claire, my sister, who had long been the beneficiary of praise and who argued in the house that appearance sometimes has to be maintained for the family to endure. There was Aunt Rosa, who collected family gossip and often acted as a courier of secrets. There was Jamal, my friend, who knew the AV world and who could reroute media. There was Pastor Thomas from the local church, who had influence over the ceremonial space and who was accustomed to offering quiet absolution in exchange for donations. There was Lena, the makeup artist, who smelled of rose oil and who later became someone I could trust. There was Officer Marks, who would eventually be the first official person I spoke to. Each of them had a role to play, and each of them made choices. Some would be small acts of complicity. Some would surprise me by siding with truth. Gathering proof was meticulous work and often terrifying. I remember the hiss of the copy machine at 3 in the morning as I duplicated an invoice that had been flagged in an email. I remember the oily thumb marks on an envelope with a check stub inside, and the faint perfume of someone who had touched it in a hurry. I recorded 2 conversations with my mother where she tried to reframe the haircutting as necessary and where she said it was for all of us. I asked her, for all of us to do what? And she responded, to survive the scrutiny. The exchange went on and on, a tangle of justifications. I saved the audio and transcribed it word for word. Jamal pulled raw footage from a rehearsal dinner where my father and a contractor discussed payments. Pastor Thomas was reluctant at first. He said, there is a way to handle this within the community. I replied, the community is part of the problem. He hesitated and then offered the names of 2 people who had access to the guest list and the AV setup. Lena, the makeup artist, agreed to hide a small microphone in the bouquet if I wanted proof at the ceremony. Officer Marks advised caution and suggested we document a chain of custody for the physical evidence. That meant sealing items, logging dates, and ensuring no one tampers with the envelopes and receipts. The technical details were dry but necessary. I made sure to photograph everything, capture metadata where possible, and keep backups off-site. I created multiple copies of audio files and sent encrypted versions to a drive Jamal controlled, and I printed out copies to bring to the attorney I consulted briefly. Those steps felt like scaffolding for a house I feared might collapse. Let me explain the technical side simply so you understand how evidence moved from private suspicion to public display. First, we secured raw files and preserved metadata by copying original footage from cameras and phones directly to a clean external drive to prevent alteration. Next, we photographed documents at high resolution and recorded the chain of possession by timestamping each transfer and having witnesses sign a log. Audio extractions were processed to reduce background noise and verify timestamps. Receipts and payment records were cross-referenced with bank statements and with emails containing order confirmations. When necessary, we used a local lab to perform a basic verification of digital file integrity. These steps took time and cost money, and they required trust. I will not gloss over that. The point is that the process made the evidence more credible and prepared it for an environment where people could not say, this is just her word against theirs. At around this point in the story, I want to pause and ask you something. If you were in my place, what would you do? If you were about to marry someone you loved and suddenly found yourself betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you, would you walk away, forgive, or expose what happened? Type in the comments how you would respond. And if you have a similar story, begin your comment with "my story" so others can find it. If you prefer one word, type it as a raw emotion, like betrayed, or freed, or scared. I read every comment, and when people share their truths, it shifts the conversation from spectacle to solidarity. Your perspective matters because these situations are not rare. Many of us carry quiet histories that live in good manners and tidy photos, and the community of voices here helps people feel less alone. Now I will continue with how we moved from collection to strategy and how the ceremony became the public stage. Strategy required timing and people who could handle logistics without being compromised. I met with Jamal in a coffee shop that smelled like burnt espresso and sugar, and we planned which devices would be primary and which would be backups. Jamal said, "We need a failsafe." I said, "What if they tamper with the AV room?" He nodded and said, "We make the proof visible in the room itself and rely on witnesses." We mapped where to place cameras, how to run auxiliary recording into a separate channel that would be stored off-site, and how to time any reveal so it would be undeniable. Pastor Thomas had been persuaded to keep the microphone check routine public so a hidden feed would be less suspicious. Lena agreed to slip the bouquet mic in the stems and to make sure the bouquet sat with me at the right moment. Officer Marks suggested having copies of certain documents on hand and a neutral person prepared to request a pause if the family tried to remove items. Claire, of course, argued that any drama would destroy our reputations and that all of this was unnecessary. I remember an argument in the kitchen where Claire said, "Do you want to humiliate us in front of the whole town?" And I said, "Do you want to keep doing this to people and call it reputation?" There were more than 5 steps in the plan, but the key elements were redundancy of recordings, a small group of trusted witnesses, and the public nature of the ceremony that would make any attempt to bury evidence more difficult without immediate scrutiny. We rehearsed the moment in whispered conversations and in a letter I wrote and gave to Jamal to read at the right point. On the morning of the event, the house hummed with the false normality of 100 small tasks. The steam from the kettles fell in lazy, cloudy ribbons. The makeup table smelled like rose oil and alcohol. There was a crackle of plastic where the dress sat, as if it knew what it was about to witness. Lena put foundation on my cheek and said softly, "This is not the story they stole." Jamal came in and checked the secondary recorder in my bag and said, "Files are mirrored." My phone blinked with messages from vendors and the florist, and my groom Mateo sent me a photo of his tie and the coffee stain on his cuff, as if to bring me into the small absurdities of the day. There were moments of tenderness that felt borrowed. Mateo kissed my forehead and said, "I am here." I said, "I know," and the word felt like a small armor. Margaret hovered, her fingers adjusting lace and then withdrawing. Claire made jokes that landed like pebbles. I felt the weight of choice again. Should I go forward and let the ceremony happen, knowing the catalyst would be a public reveal, or should I stop it and make the confession a private humiliation? Officer Marks arrived and nodded at me with the kind of look people give when they believe you have already decided. He said, "The safest option is to document now and confront later." I answered, "The safest option is not always the just option." We walked into the place where 200 people sat under warm lights and the air smelled like perfume and lemon candles. The AV technician had been paid to do the standard checks and never suspected he was part of a choreography for exposure. The pastor greeted guests and murmured words about love and family. I could hear the rustle of programs, the clink of glasses, the low hum of conversation. Jamal had set up an auxiliary feed that recorded the microphone channel directly to a cloud account he controlled. Lena had the bouquet mic in position. Officer Marks sat by the side door with a witness. The letter I had written lay in my clutch as a plan B. I would speak if the moment required it, but my hope was that the evidence itself would be self-revealing. The entrance music began, a fragment of a cello piece that bent on itself. My shoes pressed into the carpet, and I felt each step as if the floor might tilt. The moment of reveal was not cinematic in the way films would stage it. It was raw and small and unavoidable. Jamal, following our sign, cued a short clip that contained a string of recorded exchanges and images of invoices. The screens that had been showing a slideshow of our lives flickered and then played the clip. In that clip, my father was heard saying, "We will handle the donation. Do not let this appear on any register." And Hector was heard replying, "We will take care of it." Another clip showed a receipt with a name that did not match the story. Told at dinner parties. The audio of my mother saying I had to have my hair cut surfaced as a layer over an image of the cup and the hair on the rug. There was a sound like a collective intake of breath, and then someone said, "What is that?" Claire stood, face sharply pale, and said, "This is not fair." My mother said, "Elena, how could you?" Father rose and his chair scraped the floor. I could see the faces at the back staring, phones out. People whispered, murmured, some laughed, some cried. Pastor Thomas looked down, his hands folded as if in prayer. There were questions shouted from tables. My cousin Diego said, "That is outrageous," and then looked away. Aunt Rosa, who had always enjoyed the gossip roll, sat with her mouth open like she had swallowed something bitter. The room felt both heavy and light because the truth had weight, and it also broke the thin film that had kept the family image intact. In the immediate aftermath, there were attempts to spin. Claire tried to insist that these were taken out of context. Margaret said it was an intervention, and the words seemed small in the space. A man from the committee, who had often defended the family in public, rose and said we should consider the privacy of those involved. I stood and asked for the microphone. There were more than 10 exchanges in that stretch, as people argued, offered defenses, demanded apologies, and attempted to close ranks. I read from the letter I had written, describing the night and the months of documents I had compiled. I said, I will not be silenced to protect a name that has cost us so much. Someone hissed, shame, and someone else applauded. The thing I had feared most happened, and yet it felt like an unshackling. For the first time in my life, Margaret did not smooth my hair with her fingers. She retreated and then left the room. Claire followed, and later would call me hysterical, manipulative, and selfish. Mateo stood by my side and took my hand. He whispered, "I knew," and the phrase was everything. The legal questions were slow to arrive, but inevitable. Officer Marks asked to take copies of certain audio files and receipts and told me how a complaint could be filed against anyone who had tampered with me medically or who had administered substances without consent. The attorney I consulted explained that proving a sleep aid had been slipped into chamomile would require toxicological evidence, which in our case was difficult because the event was not discovered until after the fact. She suggested focusing on the documented payments, the recorded conversations, and the pattern of concealment in lieu of a direct medical indictment. That strategy aimed to establish motive and conspiracy rather than a single act of physical assault. It was technical and unsatisfying in its limits, but it had teeth. The community conversation shifted. Local journalists asked for comments, and a small committee opened an inquiry into the venue and certain donations. People began to speak in public spaces about reputational protection and what we owe each other as neighbors. Some friends whispered to me months later that they had seen my story as a turning point. There were 3 moments of tension that stood out as decision points, each with the kind of internal friction that feels like a worn hinge. The first was the morning I discovered the hair. I remember the sharpness of disbelief and the slow calculation that turned disbelief into action. I sat against the hallway wall with the photograph in my hand and the muffled ticking of a clock and had to decide whether to let the event dissolve into the familial version of what had happened or to hold it up and see who flinched. The second moment was during the collection of evidence when Pastor Thomas offered a private resolution in exchange for silence. He sat across from me in a small office that smelled of old books and wood polish and said, "We can keep this within the fold." The offer felt like a sieve meant to catch pain and let shame pass. I said no and felt the consequent loneliness bloom. The third was seconds before the slideshow at the ceremony, when my throat tightened and I imagined walking away and letting the room dissolve back into polite silence. Each time memory rose, my pulse pushed in my ears and choices narrowed like the closing of a hand. In each moment, I chose exposure over concealment because the alternative felt like validation for the behaviors I had endured. After the ceremony, the consequences were messy and real. A month later, certain community donors publicly withdrew financial support from the family foundation, and a small local paper published a piece that quoted several taped conversations and included photographs of invoices. The town was small, and the ripples were visible. Some neighbors who had once waved from porches now avoided eye contact. A few people came forward privately with similar stories. One woman named Rosa from down the street hugged me in the grocery store and said, "I always wondered," and she left a folded note with documents she wanted me to see. 3 months later, a community group I did not expect reached out and asked me to speak at a listening session. They wanted to understand how reputation had been weaponized and how to create safer spaces for those harmed by silence. The session was in a room that smelled of coffee and eucalyptus, and there were tears and apologies that felt like bandages. 6 months after the ceremony, a small nonprofit fund was founded by people who had been moved by my story and who wanted to provide resources for those needing legal help to confront family-based wrongdoing. It was not a panacea, but it was a structure that made change more likely. I still have scars, some visible, some not. But the arc of the months that followed taught me that public exposure can fracture an image and create room for accountability. There were costs. Some family members severed ties. Claire would later refuse to attend any event I organized. Margaret and I did not speak for months, and when we did, the conversations were rigid and practical. There was a legal settlement offered that attempted to silence parts of the record and protect certain parties, and I refused. I chose instead to work with the community group and to sit for interviews that would help others contextualize what had happened to me as part of a pattern of protecting reputation over people. I built a small network of allies that included a lawyer named Priya, who specialized in family financial misconduct, Jamal, who kept sending me backup links and gentle texts that read like lifelines, Lena, who now runs a small salon and volunteers at support meetings, Pastor Thomas, who publicly apologized for his initial reluctance and has since worked to create more transparent church protocols, Officer Marks, who assisted with documentation, and Aunt Rosa, who eventually expressed regret and helped me connect with extended relatives who had been victims of similar maneuvers. Each name is a ledger entry in the currency of survival. 6 months from that night, there were calmer days. There were also adjustments. I stopped attending certain ceremonies, not out of spite, but out of a careful reevaluation of what I would expose myself to. I started a private online group for people dealing with family reputational control, and we had weekly calls that smelled like the virtual equivalent of warm tea and shared sandwiches. The nonprofit created a small emergency fund and a memo of best practices for documenting and reporting when family complicity produces harm. I taught a workshop on preserving digital evidence and discussed basic steps to protect metadata and copies of files. The grafted structures of my life held, and new ones grew. Mateo and I built a wedding later that was small and intentional. The dress this time was chosen by me entirely, and I chose a style that did not require a veil and did not demand silence. If there is a conclusion to all of this, it is not tidy. I did not win a public moral victory that wiped away complications. I did, however, make a choice to refuse a pattern that had long benefited others at the expense of personal dignity. The choice to expose was not revenge, pure and simple. It was an insistence that reputation cannot be the currency used to pay for concealment and control. The aftermath taught me that public visibility can be a tool for accountability when it is used with care and corroborated evidence, but it also taught me that exposure has consequences that ripple in unpredictable directions. If this story touched you, please leave a comment with a single word that sums how you feel or with your story, which begins with "my story." If you found the process informative and would like more content about preserving evidence and confronting family complicity, consider subscribing. We produce narratives and resources that aim to turn private harm into collective conversation and practical steps. In the quiet now, there is repair work. My relationships are different, sometimes better, sometimes permanently altered. I have learned to set boundaries that are specific and enforceable. I still visit the house sometimes for practical reasons, and sometimes to sit in a room that used to feel like a stage and breathe. I have learned to value allies who name the truth and technicians who refuse to be part of silencing. I have also learned to carry less shame. If you are in a similar place, remember that documentation matters more than intensity of feeling in the moment. Photos, timestamps, copies sent to trusted third parties, and a few witnesses who are willing to sign a log can be the difference between a private dismissal and public accountability. I will continue to bring stories like this to light because I believe that dignity returns when people refuse to accept that image is more valuable than integrity. Thank you for listening to this long confession and investigation. If this video mattered to you, please consider sharing your voice below and subscribing so we can keep telling stories that demand attention and change.